Okay, I think most of us are in now. So, good morning, happy Monday morning. Great to see so many people here on a Monday morning interested in innovation funding. So thank you very much all for joining us. It's nice to see some familiar faces, but also many people who I don't think have been to our events before. So welcome everyone. I am Kristina Glushkova. I'm the Business Impact Lead at Story Futures, where I look after some of our R&D programs and our industry engagement. And I will just kick off in the next few minutes. I would also like to introduce my colleague, Ikra Bukhari. Ikra, can you wave just to so people know who you are? Yeah. So if you have any technical issues or any questions as we go along, about the meeting or arrangements or anything like that, please feel free to drop Ikra a line either here or by email. Ikra is going to share her email as well. So just a couple of housekeeping points before we kick off. So if you could, for kind of networking purposes, put your first name, last name and organization as your name in the session, that would be great, because then people will know where you come from. And you can do that by just clicking the three dots on the top right corner of your own image, or you can also do that in the participants list. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you're speaking, and there will be opportunities to speak and ask questions as well. We will unmute you, or you can unmute yourself as you do that. The last thing to say is that we are recording the session, as a few people who wanted to attend couldn't be here. So if when you ask questions you don't want to be on camera, please just switch your camera off as you do that. Right, so welcome once again. So why are we doing this event today? Why are we all here? As you all know, there is an increasing desire from funders to support innovation and collaboration between industry and academics. And, you know, we see a lot of that. We work with quite a few companies and academics who apply for funding or are interested in doing that. And so we thought, you know, we'll bring together experts in different aspects of innovation funding today, because it can be at times, particularly when you're new to this space, it can be you know, tricky to navigate all the different opportunities and differences between them. So today is really a chance to hear from experts on the topic who have many years of experience working on funding applications, strategy for innovation funding, and research funding as well. We will have plenty of time for discussion towards the end and in between the presentations as well. So I hope it proves useful to you. I'll just run through the agenda very quickly. So this is our agenda today. I will shortly hand over to Fiona Kilkelly to talk about Innovate funding opportunities, and then Chris Daly will cover research councils and the way that they enable collaboration between academics and industry. We then have Professor Mark Lysett talk about R&D collaboration between academics and industry and what to think about in that process and some tips for success. I will briefly cover funding opportunities from Story Futures, although today is not about Story Futures as such. I will mention some of our main funding streams, and happy to talk to people about those opportunities as well. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion. I would like to invite Fiona Kilkelly as our first speaker to talk about Innovate. I'm sure most of you know Fiona, have come across her work. Fiona has worked in innovation and emerging technologies in the creative sector for over 25 years. And she has, of course, set up and run Immerse UK as well. And Fiona comes with extensive knowledge of innovation and collaboration opportunities, and including funding, and having worked for Innovate. This is a really unique opportunity to hear from Fiona. So without any further ado, I will hand over.
Thank you, Christina. Hello, everybody. Really nice to see some familiar names and faces this morning. I'm sure you're all raring to go, thinking Monday morning, what do I need more than sorry, I need to go back to the beginning on my slide. What do I need more than anything is an introduction to Innovate UK funding. So I'll try and make it as interesting as possible. Look, it's not very complicated. It's actually quite a simple process. I think a lot of people get kind of caught up in it. So I wanted to talk it through with you from my perspective. I'll give you an overview of Innovate UK funding, a snapshot of the key things around the application process. I'll go through something called the Assessor's Prayer that we created a couple of years back, then look at some top tips, and then show you where to go for support. So I think it's always good to start with, what does UKRI look like? I was constantly getting, what's KTN, what's the catapults, how does it fit with research councils? But UKRI was set up 3 years ago, and it brought together the Research Council and Innovate UK funding. And in fact, their new website's pretty good, that they launched a month or so ago, because for the first time ever, you get all of the research funding and all of the innovation funding in one place. So I know the research councils will be covered later on by Christopher. I'm going to talk about Innovate UK, and they get about 303 million a year to spend specifically on research and development. Sitting alongside that is ISCF and the most relevant Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund competition. To you guys really would be audience of the future, but that's still part of the UKRI family. So Innovate UK, they do smart grants. So they happen 4 times a year. One just closed a couple of weeks back. There'll be another one probably mid to end of Feb. They do sector-led competitions, manufacturing, health, very specifically targeted around sector challenges. They've had all their COVID-19 support ones this year, which are probably, most of you might have gone in for actually, the Future Fund, et cetera, which are all very open, simple, a much simpler application process. I think we'll probably see those wrap up and go back to more smart grant-led innovation from next year. There's KTPs, which are really brilliant, and some really good ones in AR and VR, which brings researchers into funded research places within businesses. Innovation loans, they do exactly as they say on the tin. They're very low cost loans from government. The investment accelerator, there was one last year under Audience of the Future in AR and VR, and that brings public R&D money together with private investment to give 100% funding to a company to innovate. And then their international programs, they're pretty, have geared their international work up quite a lot over the last 2 years, and they run missions like DIT, business missions and expert missions to key territories for AR and VR, which are West Coast of America, China, South Korea, and Canada. Just so you have that on your radar. ISCF, Audience of the Future, there was a £60 million demonstrator. They had the investment accelerator that I just mentioned. They funded 21 projects in, under the PIC, the Production Innovation Competition, which was about developing things faster, quicker, cheaper, essentially. And then also underneath that sits the creative industry clusters, which you know about because you're in one, in Story Futures. There's 9 of them all together. There's also Story Futures Academy, and there's also the PEC, the Policy and Evidence Centre. And all of this sits underneath what was called the Creative Industry Sector Deal, which you're probably familiar with, along with a raft of other initiatives as well. So the very basics. Before you look at an Innovate UK competition, you need to consider 2 things. If you meet the scope and you meet the eligibility criteria, start to press on. Don't try and squeeze your R&D into a scope that's nowhere near what you're trying to do with your research. You'll more than likely meet the eligibility criteria, because if you're a UK SME and you're trading, you're good to go. The application process is simple. It's online through what's called the IFS. It's up and running. You can register, get your application going whilst you're doing the application locally on your computer, and then upload the content, the information before you finally send it in. Most competitions follow a similar format. So try it once, try it twice, try it 3 times. And most companies I know who've won Innovate UK money, it wasn't on their first application. It was certainly on their second, if not third. Most competitions allow you to resubmit. Some competitions don't, but bear in mind, you can't keep doing it. If you've got a project that's been sitting on a pile by your computer for a year or 2, you've got 2 shots basically at Innovate UK funding. So do it once, take the feedback, do it better, and do it a second time. You probably won't have another shot after that unless it's a completely new piece of R&D. Nobody will go forward, and lots of people do this, if you don't complete all the sections on the application form and you don't meet the word count. Literally, you will not go forward for assessment. And if there's no clear innovation, if you're not articulating within your application that you are actually doing innovation and some new R&D, you'll be you won't go forward for assessment. On top of that, the small print you need to know about before you decide to go even further is how the money works. And people tie themselves up in a knot about this, but it is quite simple. And there's a really, really good project finance guide. I'll share the link with you later on the Innovate UK website. But as a company, you get 70% funding for most of them. The COVID-19 ones had a different framework and there was de minimis. But normally, we're talking about, bear in mind, smart grants here and the sector-led competitions for the purposes of this talk are 70% funded. And that's as a single company. You can go in as a collaboration and work with a series of partners in a consortia. Most people normally bring in a university into that. And bear in mind, if you do that, if you are working with the university, they get 80% of the full economic costs of the budget. Research organizations will get 100%. But both the universities and the research organisations will only ever get 30% of your full 100% budget. So Royal Holloway, working with one of you on a project, you can only put 30% of your budget towards academic spend, and they'll get 80% of that 30%, if that makes sense. So there are 4 key things that Innovate UK will want you to see you've answered successfully before they'll base their investment decision if you can answer these 4 questions correctly. And the whole of their application form are based on these 4 questions. So don't do the application form until you do this. And if you feel you can answer these 4 questions, put the time and effort into making an application. So if you've gone through the first and second, and this is the 3rd step I've talked about, if you've ticked so far, then put the time and effort in making an application. So you need to show that there's a big enough market, and you need to show it represents value for money compared to the investment they're going to make. So for every pound they invest in your company, how much more value are they going to get out of you? Can the innovation be world leading? Is it distinctive? Is it strong enough to be exploited globally as well as in the UK? And is it at the right stage of development? And it must be market driven. And this is why it's Innovate UK funding and not Research Council funding, because it's all about market driven research. It's technical research about getting to an audience and a consumer. And why should public money be used? Why can't you as a company go and collaborate with somebody else, use a bit of your reserves to try and do this R&D? Why does government need to step in? So you need to say, hey, government, without you in here right now with us, the world isn't going to be a better place in a year's time, because it's your money that's going to help us do something game-changing and world-changing and different. So the assessor's prayer, and I think this is really useful. When you're making an application, think about it from an assessor's perspective, because they'll be going through 15, 20 applications. And if you come in with one that makes their life really super easy and is an enjoyable read, you're halfway there. So that they don't have to spend double the amount of time having to go through back through an application trying to figure out what is it they meant in question 3 and 4. I just don't get it. Because that just leads, and they've got another 15 applications sitting beside them that they've got to do, and it's so 6 o'clock on a Monday evening. Make it as easy for an assessor as possible. There's 10 questions, 3 appendices. Each question's got 400 words. You've got 4,400 words to play with here and to convince them that they should fund you. So I'm going to quickly go through those 10 questions super quickly. This deck will be shared just to give you an idea of the pitch and tone you need to have with each question. Project summary, this isn't scored, by the way, but this is gold dust. This beginning is a very short economist style, 9-word sentences, active. It's the first thing they read. You want to show them in very short, simple terms what it is you're trying to do. And they'll go, great, I get that. I like this. What's next? The need and the challenge. You need to tell them what the business need is and what the technical challenge is that you're trying to solve. And you need to say that very simply. Here's an unmet business need that's costing or denying X amount in the market. We can develop the tech, the product, the solution to fix this challenge. And when we do it, there's a market there that will buy it. And by the way, here's some data that shows you we've done the thinking and the research, so we get the wider context and the business case as to why we think you need us to fund us to do this. And when you do, it'll make a difference. The next question's on approach and innovation. These are all 400 words, by the way, as well. So we will technically solve the challenge by doing X, Y, and Z. This is better than our competitors A, B, and C, because based on our research and intelligence, this does not exist. So we will deliver these 4 outputs for you. And here's a little kind of wow factor in your appendix, kind of picture of what that looks like. Simple as that. Teams and resources. You want to say our team is the best, and here are the credentials of a really good kind of tight team. We know each other, or if we don't know each other, we've brought them in because they're super, super good and they're critical to the delivery of the project. We're using subcontractors, or we're using people on PAYE, or we'll need to bring in these additional resources, and here's how we'll get them. And this is why we need to do it. And don't be shy about this. Really big yourself up about how good the team is. Market awareness. So what does the market look like that you're targeting? So this is where you need to do a lot of market research and data drilling. You want to show the trends, the numbers, the references to show you really know exactly what's going on globally in terms of this market, and show what your target addressable market is. You can be very sensible or conservative about this, argue about why you think this is the case. Very often with AR and VR, companies kind of say, well, look, there's no real evidence out there yet. The market's still nascent. We can't prove the strength of the market. Well, look at the nearest best thing. So if it's an online learning or an online training course, look at the strength of the online training market anyway, and then do some guesstimation and work as to how that translates. If that was within, you add that, go plus sign the power of training in AR and VR equals together a very strong picture as to why the market value could be potentially huge for training in AR and VR, for example. Outcomes and routes to market. How are you going to grow your business as a long-term result of this project? So you need to show that this R&D is a really key stepping stone, not just to get the R&D done, but for your company's growth. So if you do this, you're going to be a stronger, better company for it, which means you're going to be a better contributor to UK GDP. So our value proposition to our target customers, how they benefit, it makes business sense to do it, it's worth X to them. Our routes to market are, talk about how credible your credible ideas, talk about preferably the market you identified in question 4 earlier on in the application, show them in a nice graph. We sit here in the market, but this project will take us to here in the market. So very kind of matter of fact, bang, we get the money, we'll grow, we'll have impact. Going on to impact. They want to see the impact that this project's going to have outside of your company and your project team. They know you're going to benefit by getting the R&D money, but what's the benefits to the wider economy or social or cultural or environmental side of things? What's the bigger win here? Because they funded you and it's attributed to this solution being implemented and reaching a market. You can also put some kind of guesstimate figures on that. Project management. This is a Gantt chart, basically. Here's a project plan, really tight, simple overview of your work packages and the costs and the research categories against the deliverables and the project management techniques you'd use. It's not good enough to say, we'll have a Zoom call on a Monday morning. You need to have a Gantt chart to show that you have an idea particularly because this project management has to go against your grant, and when your grant is drawn down. So they need to know they can trust you to run the project and run the funding. Risks, most people fall down on this one. Risks is super important. There's some really good risk registers out there that you could actually look for good templates around what a risk register looks like. And this is a graph as well to show you've done a risk assessment, like a commercial one and a technical one. Most people just do a technical one, or environmental, whatever, but also assign that risk to someone and have a sensible plan to mitigate that risk. And then coming towards the end, additionality, impact of public funding. You need to tell them why you cannot do this research without government rolling up their sleeves and getting involved. That you seriously need to do this. You've tried other routes, it's not out there. This will get you to where you need to be faster, and the impact of them investing in you is going to have a wider impact and benefit outside of just growing the company. And look at all of these incredible ways in which your funding is going to make a difference. And then cost and value for money. How much will it cost? How does it represent value for the taxpayer? Again, this goes back to, for every pound that Innovate UK put into your research, what's it going to yield in return? And you just need to say it's excellent value for money. Look how we've really sensibly costed the work packages. We're being very, we've thought a lot about the budget and the spend. We know that the return to the taxpayer comes from increased VAT. We're employing more people. We're going to make things faster, better, cheaper for companies, to help companies grow and work. It's contribution towards government's agenda, etc. So there are the 10 questions with very kind of simple kind of 3-liners about what you need to think about when you respond. And I think the key thing to remember with all of that is this isn't necessarily about you, your company and your research, and just an opportunity for you to talk about how good your research is and how technical it is and this great new technical interventions you're using. It needs to be geared towards the scope, and an assessor being able to read the answer to each of those questions and go, yeah, I can give it a 5 out of 5 or a 10 out of 10. So what does a good application look like? If you tick all of these boxes, you're doing very well. It's aligned to the scope. It shows clear innovation, has a strong business case and a convincing value proposition. There's a credible plan there for research and development. The consortium's brilliant, or it's a single company, it's the right single company. It demonstrates the need for support and it includes the right kind of risk. And it's interesting to read and there's no mistakes or typos. The amount of assessors that will say, who will end up being quite frustrated because it's badly written, there's typos everywhere, and people haven't shown that they've taken care with writing their application. Top tips, get started early, do your budget first. Look at, if you've got a consortium, do your agreement early so you're not all going to fall out at the 11th hour because the IP proves to be an issue. Be clear and concise, you don't have a huge amount of space, every word will matter. Make a realistic plan. If you get the funding, this isn't kind of fun and games. If you get the money, you're going to have to deliver against it, because if you don't, it's not going to look very good for any future hopes you may have for getting R&D funding in the future. Be convincing. Ask yourself this, as well as trying to prove it in the application. Why do you need the money? Is this the right money for you? Maybe you should get a work with a VC. Maybe you're not ready for public R&D yet. Remember, risk and innovation, projects need equal quantities of both to be eligible for Innovate UK funding, and that's why that risk register is important. Use numbers and evidence. So many applications just do not use the data that's out there and easy to get to back up your application, and don't leave it too late. Everybody says this. It always becomes a nightmare at 20 minutes, half an hour before deadline and systems crashing. So there are some of the links that this will be shared with everybody. I was going to put some I was hoping that there'd be some interesting open calls to put up there. There's not really, and there's something, there's one or two that might be relevant but borderline. But UKRI, this new website's really good. So you can have a look through that. The next Mart will be out in February. I'm hoping some of the ISCF funding, who knows, with Audience of the Future, they may have some news and some new competitions coming out Q1, certainly Q2 next year. General guidance for applicants. KTN have got a good application guide. Innovate UK have their own one. Their project cost guidance form is a support guide is really, really good. And any of your questions around how the money works, I think they address it really well then. And they've got the support line too. You can call them anytime. And I will just leave you in my last minute or two with some of the things I've discovered working with companies. But I've touched on some of them in this presentation, but it's about being ready and 100% it's right for you. I've gone through a lot of R&D forms with companies who've gone to the bother of actually making the application and putting weeks of effort in to review it, to figure out actually the company haven't really thought about their addressable market. And actually they're not in the right point in their, they're not at the right time to actually go in and get R&D money. They need to go back and do a bit more research first. And public money is public money. It's got government criteria. You can't suddenly change halfway through your proposal because you wanted to change the budget or you want to bring a new partner on board. It's got you're given the money based on the application you make now, and you've got to stick to the criteria, the funding, the partners, etc. that you've put in an application. Make sure you can match fund. How are you going to get your 30%? Know that before you apply. Don't think you can fudge it towards the end. Have your budget prepared in advance so you know realistically how the match is going to work. I mentioned the restrictions of public funding. Make it an enjoyable read. Every time in KTN, we had a really good application to review. We all kind of went, wow, guys, this is a really great application. Do you want to read it? It looks really good. So people get excited about it. Nothing worse than a long, laborious project application to read. But lastly, and this comes up all the time, know what type of R&D you're applying for. There's feasibility, industrial and experimental. And the amount of applications that at the very end go, oh, I've got to tick a box, is industrial or experimental R&D. Industrial R&D is for research and development that's very close to market. So you're kind of 70% there. You're trying to get your product or your service to a consumer or to an audience. That's only 50% funded. Experimental is the 70% funded R&D. So you could have done all the hard work and done your budget and not thought about this and ticked industrial, and it completely scuppers your application because you're only going to get 50%. It's experimental you want to go for if you're doing R&D that's earlier than kind of market stage. And I think that's about it. I think there's a Q&A then, Christina.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much, Fiona. That was incredibly helpful, and it did make my Monday morning. It was great. There are a few questions. Why don't, Charlotte, if you're up for going on the video to ask your questions, because you had a couple, then feel free to jump in.
Sure thing. Hi Fiona.
Hello, hi Charlotte.
That was amazing. Honestly, that deck is gold dust. I wish I'd had it before. Yeah, I'm actually just 2 days away from a deadline, so but I'll still be revising my answers in line with some of the things you just shared there. I had a couple of things to ask. You mentioned about having a good ratio on sort of how much bang for their buck they're getting from the investment, and I just wondered what a good ratio might look like in your opinion. That was one question. I'll wait and give you the second one maybe.
That's a really good question. I mean, if you read UKRI's annual reports, generally there was, I think last year there was, for every £1 invested, they raised 6 or 7 quid. So they have their own, for every £1 we want to show a contribution of 6 or 7 towards GDP. You don't need to say that in your application.
No.
You don't need to put figures on it, but I think you need to indicate by saying it's going to make such a vast change to the way things are currently done, and it's going to improve efficiencies or etc. or providing you. So I think that's kind of good enough for them to say there's a demonstrable market here that's that would benefit from the money we're investing.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And the other question was just about subcontracting. So the thing I'm proposing is actually a multi-sensory augmented reality game, and I was considering subcontracting out some of the AR work to the company I quite regularly work with in France. So largely because we often kind of brainstorm together, myself kind of as creative lead, but one of their guys as kind of creative technologist, because my, you know, technology is not quite at the level of a creative technologist. So I could either kind of use him more as a consultant and try and keep all the development team UK based to avoid subcontracting out all of the AR work to him as the creative tech lead and then his development team. So because that would actually mean subcontracting almost half of the money I was asking for, which maybe would automatically be just a big red flag for them, even if I was retaining IP in that contractual agreement. But I just wondered, you know, what's considered acceptable in terms of subcontracting, especially if you're talking about a foreign subcontractor.
Yes, I think subcontract costs, you need to be really justifiable. In this case, it sounds like if this is the only, if you need to get hands on this expertise to deliver, then you can justify it that way. But they like to see the majority of the R&D happening in the UK and not outside of the UK. But it's your application form. You can show where the R&D is happening. And if you're using consultancy from somebody who's non-UK and in COVID terms, you're COVID proofing your business to a certain extent, it's justifiable. That that person can't come to the UK and work on the project, for example. So you can subcontract, just be very realistic about it's not, you know, it's not some huge amounts. The R&D, most of the R&D is happening in the UK and you've sorted the IP out. Okay. Does that answer?
Yes, I think so. So if we're kind of keeping the subcontracting out to, let's say, under 20% of total project cost, does that sound sort of...
But yeah. Oh yeah, I wouldn't go much higher than that.
Yeah, right. Okay. Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Thank you for a great question, Charlotte. There are a couple of questions from Mitch Turnbull. Would you like to come and ask those questions on video?
Good morning, everybody.
Hi.
Good morning from Bristol. Yeah, just sorry, just very quickly clarify, Fiona, the graph question on risk, because that I didn't quite understand. You said that was a graph question to display risk.
The risk, there is, okay, I can send you an email afterwards, Mitch, but there's some, you can Google some templates for risk registers. And a risk register can very simply, there's some templates which show graphs that you can kind of copy and use and apply against your project. Because there are a couple of risk registers that you see come up in applications all the time that are really good.
Okay, brilliant.
So just good models, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because I work with, risk assessments usually is what I do, which is more of a sort of document template, but graph, great, that would be fantastic, thank you. And then also just, you know, best resources on market research without having to spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds on reports.
I've seen really good applications just from Googling what public data and information is available already. No, definitely don't spend money on reports because nobody apart from big corporates are in a position to do that. I think working with what's available should be sufficient. I've never struggled finding additional data in applications.
Great. Okay. Yep. No, I thought there might be something, you know, above and beyond the sort of normal.
No, if you attributing it, it's great to show this research and it was done by so and so recently. As a source is really good. You don't need to buy discrete reports at all, I don't think.
Great.
Personally.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome, Mitch.
Thanks, Mitch, for the questions. I'm just seeing if there are any other questions. You can ask the question in the chat or you can raise your hand in the participants list if you know how to do that. So you just go to participants list and there is an option to raise your hand and we will invite you to speak. Also, if you've done applications recently, would love a perspective from anyone who has experience to just jump in and share that as well. I know some people in the audience have had different experiences of submitting applications. So, do feel free to share any reflections. We will have time towards the end of the session as well for a more kind of discussion. But I had a question, Fiona, as well, if I can. you mentioned about kind of being at the right stage of development. And also towards the end, you talked about industrial versus experimental research. I'd love to hear a bit more on that. We work with companies who, either come with a very new idea that hasn't really been, worked on yet, through to companies that have worked with us to create prototypes, through to something that's more thought through and kind of ready for market rollout. And sometimes the questions that we get quite a lot is, what's the right balance between showing that you have already done quite a lot of thinking and developed some ideas versus showing that you actually do need funding and that it is really innovative and risky, so that it qualifies as R&D. So any reflections on that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a difference between showing it's risky and showing it's new R&D with being convinced that you've convinced about your own proposition. So there's quite a few projects where companies, and there might be smaller, more early stage companies going through kind of early, this might be their first application, having a pretty well thought through, robust idea. I've done some market research, done some user testing, but it's still, by going through the application with them and asking a series of, probably, when I work with companies, we ask a lot of difficult questions, finding out actually it's not that watertight, or there's a couple of, there hasn't probably been as much market research, as much user testing, finding little gaps and loopholes in the concept, which means that the application isn't convincing enough. So that's, and that is just, when I say not being at the right stage, not having spent enough time really developing the idea, essentially. Because you could spend lots of time developing an idea and you have done that, there are no holes, it is watertight, and it can be super high risk. That can be a high risk idea, but you've absolutely demonstrated with gusto that there's a need, there's, it's right for funding.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And then on that point of, having developed a prototype, I think there's sometimes nervousness around like, well, we've already done all of that kind of initial thinking. Can we qualify for Innovate funding? So do you have any thoughts on how people view kind of early stage prototyping? Is that a good thing, or is that something that, you should apply for money for to innovate to do, rather than having done it and then applying for the next stage? Or is that all completely call dependent?
So it depends on the competition as well. Some of them are open to, particularly the COVID-19 ones, were actually more towards being more market ready, actually, because they wanted to deploy them quickly. But most competitions are around feasibility or industrial and experimental. Industrial being the closer end to the market, you can still apply, but you're going to get only half the amount of the budget. So sorry, what was your question there, Christina? Again, you said is
it a good thing to have basically already done early stage prototyping, and how you present that in your application? What's the kind of good approach to that?
So there is a sense that if there's a prototype up and running, that you might be kind of probably what the question would be, well, why aren't you perhaps out there talking to investors? You have a prototype. Isn't the next step now to build it and get it to market? A lot of the smart grants are around prototyping, feasibility, doing the piloting. So you wouldn't want to have had a prototype up and running if you're possibly going for a smart grant, because that's what the smart grant's there to do. There's probably ways as a company you can reframe what you've done to date for an application. So you can probably reframe your research, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
In order to apply for a competition to fit the stage of research you're at. If genuinely you feel there's a need for you to do that, and more time doing it better will be the win, then I think that's completely justifiable. But it's also about working with what you've got and working with what they're asking you to make it fit as well.
Great, that's really helpful. I mean, a lot of some of our work is around very early stage prototyping that still needs a lot of kind of R&D work on, to take it forward. So it might be about also explaining that quite clearly and positioning that in the right way. I had another question as well. You mentioned IP arrangements and kind of, you know, being clear on your IP arrangements and not leaving it to the last minute. So in your experience, what kinds of things tend to come up around that? And any advice on IP, basically, that you can give, you know, in terms of getting it right, and it would be really helpful.
I always find this really tricky, and I tend to kind of not, I wouldn't give my personal opinion too much around IP. I think IP is a very personal thing with the company and if who they're collaborating with. There are IP frameworks that Innovate UK recommend working to that are available within their guidance. The name completely escapes me. There's one very regular research, universities and businesses use it. It's a common framework around IP. They may often ask for big funds to show that you've got in your collaboration agreement, you've sorted the IP out. So having a sense of it very early on and having it agreed within your consortia is super important, so you don't trip yourself up towards the end. In some cases, some projects, I've referred them to an IP specialist because it's just been too complicated to handle.
Yeah, but basically thinking about it as early as possible is probably
I mean, I don't think it's complicated for people who are really watertight and really bedded in with working together. This is going to be part of the working process they've had to deal with already. So the framework for that's in place as we go in for a bit. It's only kind of new ones who are bringing people in quickly to try and make a bit work where it can get tricky.
Yeah. I know Mark might reflect on that later in his talk, but as a university, and all universities have kind of IP frameworks and approaches in place. So again, if you are working with a university, it's worth having that conversation early on, because there will be a process to go through and kind of templates to look at and so on. All right. I think we've come to a break now. I know there are a couple more questions from Charlotte. So Charlotte, we'll pick these up maybe afterwards or towards the end of the event. We'll see you here at 9:55. Please come back on time. We'll kick off at 9:55 with Chris's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, welcome back. Just to say again, do feel free to post questions as we go along. We will be picking these up in the Q&A. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Chris Daly, who is a colleague of mine. Chris works in our Research and Innovation Department at Royal Holloway, and as a research development manager, and in his role, he supports academics thinking through their strategy in relation to research funding and innovation funding, and particularly focusing on skill development and key strategic funding bids as well. And Chris has over 10 years of experience working in the sector and really understands funder strategies and the landscape for research funding more broadly. So Chris, thank you for being here today, and over to you.
Thank you, Christina. So I'll just quickly share my screen with you. Hopefully everyone will be able to see this. Okay, can you all see that? Yeah, cool. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to talk then just for about 10 to 12 minutes really about the research funding landscape and the potential opportunities for business within it. So my role is, as Christina pointed out, is that I'm research development manager. So I help academics with their funding applications, with research ideas and matching it with funders and developing bids and doing some grant writing as well. So I don't work directly with business, and my background is an academic background as well. So I'm not someone who kind of is necessarily au fait with everything you may ask, but hopefully I can be helpful from presenting some advice about funding from the perspective of a university. So what I'm going to cover today then is I'm going to talk about, firstly, just the context of research funding within which academics work. And then I'm going to talk about the potential opportunities for business within UKRI programs, excluding Innovate, because obviously Fiona's provided a fantastic overview already of that. And then a little bit just about working with academics. I'm not really sure whether some of you may already have experience with working with academics quite a lot. Others may be quite new to it. So I've just provided a slide where I kind of outline some of the key points that I have in mind, particularly when I work with academics, but I think are also useful for business as well. Okay, so just to start with then, I think it's important to put research funding in its kind of wider context. So I always advise academics when they're looking for research funding opportunities to look first of all really at the strategies of individual funders. And the best place to start with UKRI particularly, I think, is what was recently released was their corporate plan for 2021. And I think that's a really useful document because it's not particularly long. It's about sort of 20 or 30 pages. It outlines kind of the overall objectives of UKRI as a whole. And then it has a kind of page or two with the objectives and strategies of each individual research council. So I look after, for example, the AHRC, and within there's a kind of just a page outlining that in the next year or so, the AHRC's priorities are going to centre around things like creative industries, for example, the creative economy, also things around climate, so environmental humanities, and also equality, diversity and inclusion as well as a key aspect to their priorities in the coming year or two. So that's a really good document just to look at, to see about what the Research Council priorities are. And if you have a particular product or a develop in your business, you can then align it with some of the priorities of particular funders. So I'd really recommend looking at the corporate plan as a starting point. Also alongside that, you might want to look at the UK Research and Development Roadmap, which was released in July this year. It's kind of quite broad brushstroke analysis of where research funding is going and R&D funding in the next 5 years. But nonetheless, it's a useful document to see the direction of travel. And then also I've just put in things like a lot of research recently. So there's been quite a lot of money pumped into, may not be so much in the future, but quite a lot of money pumped into things like the Global Challenges Research Fund as well, which is aligned directly with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a lot of focus within the academic community on challenge-led research, and whether that's research that's tackling big kind of global challenges, or whether it be ones that are more kind of domestically focused and looking to do kind of big interdisciplinary projects that focus on domestic challenges within the UK as well. So do kind of look at those strategy documents. So I just here in this slide just kind of tried to map out the kind of major funders that we deal with. So on the top level, this isn't a kind of a sort of top level and bottom level. It's just meant to be to divide the page in two. But you have kind of UKRI as a kind of umbrella organisation, as it were, that sits with the research councils, the 9 research councils sitting underneath it, or as spokes of UKRI, if you will. And UKRI, you see a kind of lot of these big programs such as Global Challenges Research Fund, Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, Future Leaders Fellowships, etc., kind of sitting almost centrally within UKRI. That's the feel you kind of get. And then they kind of devolve out, particularly with GCRF, for example, devolve out the management of individual schemes or programs to individual research councils. And obviously the research council that you'll probably be most interested in, as Fiona talked about, is Innovate UK. But there are opportunities for business within the other research councils as well. I'll talk about, for example, ESRC, which I'll come on to in a moment. And beneath that, also we deal with primarily these other major funders outside of UKRI, which are the academies and societies, first of all. So this is most obviously organisations such as the British Academy, Royal Society, etc. And interestingly, I've kind of put an arrow going back and forth to UKRI, because academies and societies do sometimes receive money from government. For example, the British Academy has a scheme such as the Global Professorship Scheme, which is receives partly funding from BAYES, which is to try and attract talent to the UK. So there is a kind of link to government and the academies and societies as well. And then, of course, other major funders such as Leverhulme Trust, Wellcome Trust, which is focused on health research across all disciplines, Obviously, the EU is a major funder, and this is all in chaos at the moment, as you're probably aware from the news. So I'm not going to talk too much about the EU because it's really, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't think anyone does at the moment. But the EU is also a great resource for businesses as well in terms of funding. You can be part of consortia, and also there are some innovation funds, which I'm going to mention one of in a little bit. Okay, so then to move on to UKRI and the research councils and the opportunities for business, I think it's important to be aware, first of all, that for most of the research councils, businesses can't be co-investigators. And there's two exceptions to this. One is Innovate, of course, where it's business-led. And the other is ESRC, who do allow for business to be co-Is. So instead, the kind of two options that you have are really to either be a project partner or a subcontractor. So this is in, and by the way, I'm talking here about standard research grants, so the general open calls that are offered by research councils, not about specific thematic calls that may have opportunities for business. And I'll come on to that in a moment. But broadly speaking, if an academic you're working with wants to apply to a standard grant with the the research councils, then your options as a project partner, whereby you can have a kind of input into the project, and you may, in terms of a project partner agreement, may be able to negotiate some kind of license where you can use the project results for commercial purposes for a limited period, but generally you won't receive any money from the project as a project partner. Or the other option is to be a sort of subcontractor, to offer a service or a kind of some expertise or specialist skill for a particular period of time to do a particular bit of work on the project. So you can be a subcontractor on projects. But being a co-investigator is not normally something that would happen on a standard research council grant, with the exception of ESRC, who do offer the opportunity for businesses to be co-Is. So this is just a table from their website. And as you can see, that if you are a business, you can apply for staff salary costs if you're a co-I, and travel and subsistence costs as well, but you can't claim for overheads. And the other important point here is that it also, it must be less than 30% of the total application, and you've got to comply with state aid legislation as well, which again is kind of slightly up in the air with leaving the EU. So the ESRC is a funder where you can actually be kind of quite heavily involved as a co-I, but not the case with many of the other funders for their standard calls. One other option for business is the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowships. So these are really, really interesting. They're 7-year fellowships, which can be up to £2 million. And they are an opportunity for an individual to develop themselves as, to be a kind of leader in a particular area of research and innovation. And these are available to business as much as they are to academia. From my experience, the majority of these have been academics in universities who've been funded for these, but nonetheless, they are, you know, open to business. And there is, if you look on the UKRI website, there is information about how business can get advice and guidance on this. The scheme is coming to an end, but there's strong indication that it's likely to be renewed, or if not renewed, then something very similar will emerge in its place. That's the kind of steer we've initially been given anyway from UKRI. So this is a kind of interesting scheme if you have kind of individuals within your business who really want to kind of develop themselves in doing a kind of big, long project. And I think Fiona touched upon this a little bit earlier, but I think it's important to also sign up for the alerts from UKRI, and also to look at their funding finder on their website, where there are a whole kind of collated list of opportunities, because that's a kind of, as I said, there's kind of thematic calls and programs that are offered that will be opportunities for business outside of these kind of standard grants where the opportunities are much more limited. So really do sign up for these alerts, and also establish relationships with academics as well, you know, because they will, you know, they will have a kind of bit more of an ear to the ground in terms of funding opportunities. And I think that in tandem, sort of signing up to lots of alerts and also having these kind of relationships with academics will kind of hopefully help you to find something relevant. And look beyond UKRI as well, major funders. There are a kind of whole range of international funders out there who do have opportunities for businesses to be involved alongside academics. And I'm just going to mention quickly that an example of this is obviously the EU is a major funder, but an opportunity that exists beyond UKRI. So in the Horizon 2020 programme, for example, they had this European Innovation Council pilot that was running, which was an opportunity for businesses to receive some innovation funding. So, so depending on what the outcome of these talks are, hopefully some kind of deal will emerge. Then there might be the opportunity as a third country for the UK, not as a third country, sorry, associate country, for the UK to businesses to actually kind of still be able to access some of the EU funding. And just finally then, I just wanted to just finish with a few points about working with academics. So from my experience, I've kind of tried to highlight 3 things that I think are quite important when working with them. Firstly is to find the right person. I think it's axiomatic, but it's also incredibly important and sometimes quite difficult to achieve. And I think it's important to maybe make use of business development, knowledge exchange teams within universities who are often based within the research office, because they have, their job is to kind of broker relationships between business and individual academics. And they really will kind of know who the people are that want to kind of form these relationships. So that's often a good place to start. And it really is crucial to have the right person, as with any project that you work on. But you really want to get the right person in terms of their expertise as well, and their understanding of where you're coming from as well. And so that leads on to my next point around finding mutual benefits. So for those of you who haven't worked with academics, academics you'll probably know are completely dedicated to their research, to the extent that some may say that academia is more of a calling than a kind of just a job. So many academics really do want to know that by working with you, that their kind of research area is going to be furthered and that there's going to be benefits to them in terms of furthering their research field. And then obviously for you, it's a kind of great, advantage to have the right academic on board whose expertise is really going to enhance a product's impact and credibility. And one final thing as well is to be aware of competing timelines. Academia works at a kind of slowish pace, I would say. And particularly if you're working with an academic on, say, a research council application, then you may submit an application and not get an answer for about 6 months, because they will go through a peer review process. There'll then be an opportunity for the principal investigator to write their response to the peer review. And this can take a lot of time for the decisions to be made. So it may be from the moment you make contact with an academic and then start working on a grant to the grant actually coming to fruition, you could be looking at kind of 18 months. So it's probably important to see relationships with academics as a kind of long-term strategic partnership rather than something that's necessarily a quick win. There could be quite significant time lags. So that's me. Hopefully I haven't run over, Christina. Hopefully I've stuck to time nicely. If you have any questions, please do let me know.
Thank you, Chris. That's brilliant. I'm glad we have you to help us navigate all this, because, there are many opportunities, but they can be quite different from, business R&D funding.